Hi there, I'm your host Clive Serkin, and welcome to the Unstuck podcast, where we're on a journey to help you get control of your work environment, get yourself unstuck, and perform to your full potential. My guest today on Unstuck is, I would say, my friend. We're still friends, right?
Oh, absolutely, we're friends.
My friend, former colleague, Dr. Nigel Hughes. Now, Nigel is the Senior Vice President, Head of Global R&D at Kellogg Co, and member of the executive committee, and I had the joy of working closely with him for a better part of 3 years. About 4 years ago, or we started probably about 7 years ago, but we had a great, I thought, a fantastic 3 years together. Nigel has 30 years in, give or take, and let's say we'll take, experience in research and development, not just R&D. He also is a commercial leader and has run P&Ls around a broad set of categories, but essentially with one goal in mind, which is breaking the paradigms or breaking behaviors to drive commercial outcomes. And so first of all, welcome, my friend. Good to have you.
Thank you.
So I've missed Nigel and I used to talk pretty much every single day for 3 years, and I've been off of my Nigel diet. So one of the things we've agreed is that he's going to do 2 podcasts with me because we got a lot to cover. But it's always good to have you sitting across the table and us catching up.
It's very good, Clive. We are at a virtual table today, so we're missing the glass of wine or the beer, but it's really great to be with you.
This can be remedied. Hey, we talked about a lot of stuff, but at the heart of what you and I were always grappling with is this sort of conundrum of innovation. And how do you innovate? And how do you wrestle with all the demons and the barriers and the thing? And, ultimately, not to oversimplify, but innovation tend to go sort of down or up in the sense of you either become really small, and it's not truly innovation, it's renovation, and it's mild news, and it's little stuff, or you go really big and it becomes insurmountable. And both of those outcomes are not great outcomes. And so I'd love to get into innovation in our second podcast, but one of the things that I know you're really passionate about is systems thinking. And the way I get it, before we start talking, and you sort of clarify, is systems thinking is a way to attack the bigness and their insurmountability, if such a word exists, of scale innovation, so that it doesn't become insurmountable. And I'd love to get into your perspective of, A, is that a good framing? And B, how do you think about systems thinking? And how do we apply it in a commercial setting?
I love that, Clive. The first thing I'd say is you already went innovation, renovation, da-di-da-di-da. I think one of the things that we can say about innovation is that we've got all these words and subwords and definitions because we're not very good at it. And I loved what you said. It either becomes these set of tiny things, in the business I'm in right now with Kellogg, all those tiny things tend to be another flavor variant, another slight pack design change. And they're not really making any difference at all. Certainly not doing, as Steve Jobs would put it, making a dent in the universe. And then there's this other stuff that we know we've got to tackle. We know is out there. And we actually really know is big opportunity, but we don't quite know how to go about doing it. And that's the kind of stuff, climate change. That's the kind of stuff with us about how do you go make foods with completely new ingredients and transform the way in which people eat and solve these big well-being problems. And so thinking about those things, and you used one of my favorite words there, paradigms, right? These are paradigm shifts. And when you start to think about those paradigm shifts, the biggest issue is that you can't just sit in an office or within one company or within one space and even start to conceive of this whole plethora of actors and players and interdependencies in a system. You use that word too, which I love, systems thinking and being able to reframe things through systems thinking. You can't even begin to do that unless you look at the problem differently. And unfortunately, you were kind enough to refer to me as Dr. Nigel Hughes, so I used to be a scientist. You're right, you remembered, Clive.
By the way,
unfortunately,
later on we're going to talk about your thesis.
Fair enough. We can do that too. But I was taught a Cartesian method, which is not about systems thinking. It's about basically thinking about objects, thinking about the simple interactions of objects, and actually taking not this whole network and complex interaction of things, but rather taking the simplest models you possibly can and trying to build up from there. And whilst I'm not dismissing scientific method and I'm not dismissing 200 or 300 years of human advancement and development, unfortunately, when it comes to these complex issues that we face today, it is extraordinarily limited.
It's incredible thing, and the thing that it's funny, you and I obviously became fast friends and very close collaborators at chasing something very exciting about it, unlocking the power of food in our day, and we came from very different places. You as a scientist and me as an operator. But one of the things that I felt connected us is because of my dyslexia, I tend to have to visualize things and I tend to have to connect things visually. And when you started talking about systems thinking, though it clicked for me. Like once you, and I'd love you to explain systems thinking from your perspective, but from me, from a very sort of base level, it's like once you understand how things fit together to get an outcome, you can start deconstructing them and get down to those the basic level points. And as I look back over certainly my experiences, and I look at examples of where companies have either cracked it or failed miserably, my feeling is they haven't understood, or conversely, when they got it right, they understood how the pieces fit together, and then were able to deconstruct the relevant pieces and reconnect them back together in a way that created different outcome. Is that a fair, is that how you think about systems thinking? And so first part, is that how you think about it? And the second part is, how would you then talk about it to someone who's listening, who's wrestling with a large sort of massive issue that they have to confront?
Okay. So I'm going to go right back to the beginning of what you said and how the way that you visualized it and you thought about it. I think the way I came, a lot of people say to me, oh, were you an engineer then? Because they hear systems thinking, they think engineer. I said, no, I was a chemist. But actually, as a chemist, what you're doing is being able to visualize all these interconnected things called molecules and the way that they spin around and are interdependent on each other. Or at least I was anyway. That's the way I did chemistry, for good or for bad. So where do I go into this? Because it's a catchphrase for sure. The first thing for me is stop thinking about the world as being made up of a set of discrete objects and start thinking about a world that is made up of a set of interactions. That's really point number one for me. The second thing is those interactions lead to outcomes which are nonlinear. That's the second point. A beautiful example. In fact, just yesterday, another old friend of mine who I hadn't met for a minute, Bob Mester, was talking to him. Bob has a beautiful example. He's recently published a book. There you go, Bob. I'll give you props for your new book. He has a beautiful example, right? To make an aircraft, you need various elements. You need an engine, you need wings, you need a fuselage, you need this and that and the other. But each one of those elements on their own can't fly. It's the interaction between the elements which creates the output of being able to fly. And that's when you start to think like that, for me, certainly it was quite aha. But it's not necessarily intuitive because it's not the way we tend to think as human beings.
Or behave.
Or behave. And really importantly, behave. Exactly, Clyde. Because the key is If you're then going to innovate using a systems approach, you've got to change your behavior. Yeah. And so if you're someone who is highly knowledgeable in one of the component elements of a system, you're going to tend to make the problem that component element, rather than saying, forget the elements, it's the interdependencies. And now, how do I start to influence? And that's another key of systems. Don't control, influence. How am I now going to influence the connections and therefore be able to drive change? Final point for me, which is really important, that's all a splendid idea. But unfortunately, the whole of the world is interconnected. And you can't make tangible difference by trying to take on the whole of the world. You've then got to decide, yes, there are some boundary conditions to the system that I'm going to look at and play with and create from. But you have to make really smart choices about what those boundary conditions are. And the boundary conditions certainly can't be the ones that are just in my convenient purview.
Well, and I frankly, we could spend the next better part of an hour just talking about those 3 points. All of this translates to the bigger problem, but when you look in ultimately innovation, which we'll talk about another time, but innovation is done by humans, and humans sit in an organization, in a company. And I sort of seen two experiences that you and I both experienced together, and I've seen longitudinally, as have you, over many organizations, is one, the people who are charged with the innovation, with breakthrough thinking, with changing a paradigm, tend to play in their part of the world and stay in their part of the world and look at the world through their particular perspective. And that becomes sort of debilitating in my view, and most certainly an inhibitor to getting to the outcome. And the other one is some of the smartest people I've encountered, and I had a long, ongoing, really difficult conversation with a very senior leader who is very, very smart. Like ridiculously smart person, but quantitatively, not conceptually, who refused to move his vantage point to try and look at the problem from a different perspective. And those two things invariably will get you stuck. I mean, if you think of yourself as an R&D person only, and think of the solution from an R&D perspective and try to solve it from an R&D, you're going to lose. And if you've refused to move your vantage point and look at the world differently from different vantage points, and to your point, relax some of those parameters, I can't see how you get out of the hole you're in.
And I completely agree with you. I characterize elements of that as great innovators find angles, not answers. But human beings have a tendency to want to find answers. I'm the one thing I'm not is a psychologist, so I won't even dare to try and go into that space. But 58 years on the planet gives you some level of psychological understanding. And the fact is, most people feel way more comfortable if they're living in a world of clearly defined answers. But an answer is an object again. It's not an interdependence, right? An angle is an interdependence. It's giving you new dimensionality. It goes back to this is me showing how poor I am on US presidents. I think it's the Roosevelt quote, right? If I want to solve a problem, I often find it's best to make it bigger.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, why is that the case? Because I found more angles, I found more access points, and I've brought more elements into my system.
Sorry, go ahead. I was going to, why do you think, and you say you're not a psychologist, but you are a keen observer of human behavior, and you've lived in it. So why do you think, and again, this is often the smartest people in the room, why do you think they are so dogmatically focused on, give me the answer, versus let's generate some angles that we can go and prove or disprove, which may or may not, may close doors or open doors, and hopefully open doors as much as it will close doors on our way to finding out a way out of this.
It's conditioning, Clive. It's entirely conditioning. I didn't necessarily think or know that this conversation would go into to schooling, but we are conditioned from a very early age. We get things right or wrong. We're scored. We're marked. And that is extraordinarily destructive when it comes to nurturing this notion of finding new possibilities. I mean, my education was a while ago. I hope education has got better, but I'm not really sure how much it has. But my education was entirely built on being right or wrong, learning definitive things. I go back to, all that goes back to Descartes and all this sort of stuff. We are not taught to create, and the creative process is one of looking at things in new and different ways. The other thing I would say is also the creative process is one that is driven by metaphor. You will not find a new solution to the same thing if you just use the same language. And I mean language in its broadest sense, meaning everything you bring to something. You have to bring new insight, and new insight comes through metaphor. Oh, look at that. What could that mean for me? And again, we're saying we'll talk perhaps more about innovation per se at another time. But what's important for me is I am constantly collecting stories. But when I collect a story, I connect that story. So my whole life, and it irritates my wife enormously, is because she'll say, "You're doing that thing again." My whole life, I am collecting stories and saying, "Yep, that one probably fits there." And then what I'll do over time is I'll filter those things and find, no, the place I put that one to start with wasn't quite the right spot. It needs to interconnect with that thing because it has more meaning if it interconnects with that thing.
Makes sense. I mean, let's talk it in your world, the system thinking in your world. I mean, as you know, I was always passionate about, we were in the food business, number one. And number two, at the end of the day, our mission was to unlock the power of food. And the power of food is incredibly broad, all the way from the power of joy and the emotional power of something as simple as a cookie and a glass of milk, to something much more profound in terms of the medicinal value of food. Mm-hmm. And I know you're a big, passionate believer in the microbiome and the gut-brain axis and all things. Talk about the kinds of, because I'm now sitting on the bench. I've been out of this for a long time. I'm in the home now, but talk about the kinds of things that you're grappling with now, and the industry is grappling with now at a macro level. What are the big issues that you guys are trying to solve in terms of the systems?
I would say the biggest one, without any question, is the whole climate change, biodiversity loss, impact of the food system, and maybe I use system with a capital S and with a small s, but the impact of the food system on all of those things. It's very real and very clear. 30% of climate impact comes from the food system. But importantly, when you look at that, most of that impact comes from the ingredients that go into the food system and the way that they are grown. And it's not just an issue around choosing plant-based versus animal-based protein and all this. Actually, it's got as much to do with the way that grains or plants are grown, the fertilizers we use, these sorts of things. And what's interesting and important there is, and this has really been fascinating me over the last 12 months or so, you can say, great, but those are commodity markets. You think about wheat, or you think about all of these ingredient streams, they're commodity markets. How do you change those kinds of things? Well, The first way you change them is because we've allowed ourselves to call these things commodities. Therefore, we have taken them out of the system. We've said they're a separated input, and we'll deal with them in a certain way rather than integrating them into the food system through the way in which we grow things, carrying that value through into the food design, and then carrying that value through to the consumer and the consumer experience. The way I relate this really simply is if you go back to when a company like Kellogg was first started by W.K. Kellogg, he was a systems thinker, but it was real simple because all he did was look out the window in Battle Creek, Michigan, and see he was surrounded by all of this wheat and grain. And therefore, he integrated that into his version of what the food system was. For us now, we have got legacy, to say the least, legacy. We are bound into things that have been created over the last 100, 150 years. Now we've got to reinvent ourselves out of that. But people then look at me and think I'm slightly nuts, but I'm an innovator, so that's what I'm supposed to be doing anyway.
For sure.
What I'm not supposed to be doing is just creating the next tiny change.
But there is a little bit of tension in there, and it's clearly resolvable tension, but there's a mismatch between the companies. There's an incumbency as a publicly traded company, Kellogg, any other company, so it's not any company that's publicly tradable, to deliver quarterly results. And so there is a huge emphasis, appropriately, on driving innovation, driving outcomes that drive a commercial outcome. The last 5 minutes, you've talked about an existential sort of global issue, right? And so it seems, and if you're not in it and you're looking from the outside in, you could easily walk away with a perspective that says climate change in the food system isn't going to get solved. It's too big. It cannot be solved. And people like Nigel can't solve it because Nigel has to deliver closer in innovation and commercial outcomes. And those two things should haunt people, if at least on the surface, or somebody's going. So how do we solve this is, I guess, my point. And I remember when I read two books back in the day. One was Third Plate and the other was Kiss the Ground, right? And there were two, I thought, wonderfully sort of accessible stories about a way forward that felt achievable, that felt like you could start making small and incremental change that could create some sort of momentum. I'm sitting here 7 years later, since I was first exposed, give or take, to those books, and I go, have we moved forward? And can we? And I won't be like a total downer.
You're sounding a little bit like a downer, Clive, but anyway, don't worry about that. That's okay.
I don't want to depress everyone.
I want to flip what you said on its head. And for the folks who are listening, most of the conversations you and I have ever had kind of went this way, as I seem to remember.
Amen.
So I want to flip what you just said on its head, because my concern is that we do have an existential issue facing us, that therefore it's an imperative to tackle that existential issue. And I don't understand how we're going to tackle it. We're not going to create some new economic system. We're not going to have startups in garages be able to do this on their own. I'm not saying that startups don't have a role to play, but on their own, because of the scale of the problem. And I just used the word problem, I'll chastise myself for using the word problem, because of the scale of the opportunity. Because of the scale of the opportunity. Now, does that make it easy? No, but it is straightforward. And I think it's always really important to distinguish between easy and straightforward. It's straightforward, meaning we know how to grow ingredients that not only, actually, and this is the fun part of the food system, we know how to grow ingredients that not only lower climate impact, but can actually be truly regenerative. And I know that's a bit of a loaded word, but I mean it in its broadest sense. It can be truly regenerative, i.e. they can They can take carbon dioxide out of the environment. So do we know that it's possible? You've heard me say this many times, Clive. I've never taken on an innovation problem in my whole career that was outside of the laws of chemistry and physics, on the grounds that I don't know how to do something that's outside the laws of chemistry and physics. Yeah, there may be some universe out there or some other whatever that where there are different laws, but this is not breaking the laws of chemistry and physics. It is therefore, and we have solutions. Therefore, it is a straightforward problem. The point is, it's not an easy problem because of the number of interdependencies. And one of the things that frustrates me, and I thought you might go here actually, so I'll go there before you go there. One of the things that frustrates me is when people start to talk to me about, well, people don't care enough about it for companies to drive in that direction. Come on, Clive, your background, your background. Yep. I've been in the consumer space for long enough. We know, and we can use all manner of cliches. We know the world is not just about what people care about today. It's creating things that they will care about in the future.
100%.
And we know that to be the case.
100%. I mean, I painted a sort of gloomy, depressing, down sort of picture to provoke a conversation, as you well know. But you could take the flip view and go, if you looked at the world, let's pick a number, 10 years ago, and you look at the world today, and you look at how many companies exist today at any level, and there are some real scale companies that are directly confronting some aspect of this challenge, you'd be flabbergasted and unbelievably positively buoyed by what's happened. I mean, just they'll pick one organization that you and I both know, S2G, Seed to Growth, Chicago-based VC fund that are exclusively focused on transforming the food system at every level across all aspects of it. And you look at the companies in their portfolio, and I use them as an example because I have the joy of spending time with Chuck often, and you've done a number of deals with them. And I see the companies in their portfolio, and I've seen over the last 7-10 years how that's grown and how so many of them scaled. It gives you, the belief that this thing will and can and is going to get solved in some shape, manner, or form. And to your point, people definitely care enough. Because if they didn't, there wouldn't be a commercial outcome.
Exactly.
And I know this isn't the best example, but it happens to be one in my house. Is like, look at Impossible, aptly named. Extraordinary commercial success in the scheme of things, relatively speaking. Not the answer to everything, but proof possible that there is a positive commercial consequence of attacking something as big as this. No,
exactly, Clive. And the parallel I draw, and again, I'm showing my age a little here, but if you go back to the first .com bubble in somewhere between 96, 97, 98, we had no idea. We had no idea that this thing called Amazon that was a very marginal thing would be within 25 years? One of the biggest companies on the planet. That happened. Now, were there a number of failures? Were there a number of .com failures? There were many. There were many, many failures. But there were many that actually have created a world that, to be clear, my children wouldn't understand the world of 1996. They wouldn't understand that world. So I have I don't just have every confidence, that's too glib. I know that within 25 years, we are going to be eating quite differently. We're still going to we're not going to be popping pills. We're going to still be wanting to enjoy our food. It's still going to be part of our celebrations and all of that kind of good stuff. But we're going to be eating quite differently. And we will have transformed huge elements of the way in which we grow things, the way in which we process things, and the way in which we then design foods around those and sell to consumer.
And Nigel, I just want to go back to this because there's all kinds of memories coming back here. But for those of you who haven't figured it out, most of people know me, but they're just getting to know you. But sort of I'm the Neanderthal and you're the nuanced one. people may have been confused in this conversation. So I'm just, but I remember I was talking trends and you went after paradigms, and you made this really strong distinction between them that was quite consequential for me, and we flipped our thinking. Talk about the difference as you see it between a trend and a paradigm, and why making that distinction is important. Because I do think it has an impact on getting stuck and unstuck.
It's fundamental. It's fundamental. Industries are not based on trends. Industries and changes in industries are based on paradigm shifts. So the example I think I first used with you, Clive, because you were fighting back against me and all this sort of stuff, was go back 120, 130 years to an age where we were just beginning to master electricity, right? Yes, people had fiddled with it. They'd made small engines and all that kind of stuff, but really nothing consequential had come. And then you've got people who became absolute titans, and the greatest inventors of their age, who began to master electricity. The move to electricity, away from steam or water and all this as power, was not a trend. It wasn't a trend. It was a paradigm shift, meaning suddenly you could have power where you wanted it, when you wanted it, and pretty much as you wanted. And that allowed you to do all kinds of incredible things. Absolutely, things which people couldn't even conceive of doing before, like lighting up whole cities and doing all this sort of stuff. Beneath a paradigm shift, there are then a set of trends which you see act out over a number of years. But a paradigm shift is generational, and it is a complete transformational breakthrough in a whole space, which is the basis for creating new industries. And interestingly, we haven't had a paradigm shift in the food space. If I go back to the previous conversation we were talking about, we haven't had a paradigm shift for quite a long time. I would argue the great food companies that were established 100 some years ago, whose core focus was about safety and accessibility, because before that, you weren't sure if the food you were going to buy was going to kill you, and it was often very, very expensive. So, per calorie, as it were. That was a paradigm shift in the food industry, safety and accessibility. Now we are on the cusp of several other paradigm shifts, because we've talked a lot about ingredients and all that, but the other side of food, which is on the cusp of a paradigm shift, is the whole well-being piece and health, and particularly this thing which I'm slightly obsessed about, as you know, Clive, called the microbiome. Yep. And the way in which we understand that, which is another system, incidentally.
For sure. A massive one. But
yes.
So chasing trends to find a transformational sort of outcome is, you do that at your own peril, because you're not going to get there. It's understanding the paradigm shift that will get you the transformational thinking.
Absolutely.
But how do you reconcile this? And then we're going to talk about your PhD. But how do you reconcile this? Some fundamental aspects of food, and where some real energy is playing out, are actually sort of going back to the beginning. And let me pick two. So you mentioned one, regenerative farming. Kiss the Ground is a great book. I think a very accessible book that talks about it. Is in many senses regenerative farming, which will be transformational in terms of its impact on climate and many other things, is sort of going back to practices that existed centuries ago. Your favorite one, which is the microbiome, in many senses is going back to a concept of food as medicine. how do you reconcile those? Because arguably they could be, it's full circle, back to the future to drive a paradigm outcome and a paradigm change.
Absolutely, absolutely. I don't have any problem putting those two pieces of logic together, because I think we often think also that a paradigm shift is based on an entirely novel insight. It's not. It's based on the ability to activate that insight at scale. Because yes, we might have had a regenerative approach to farming, but we couldn't utilize that at scale and pull it through the food system.
Yep.
That was our problem. Now our ingenuity allows us to be able to truly do that at scale and pull it through the whole system and feed 8 billion people, not feed. And this is a really critical one. It might be a good jumping off point for innovation, and not feed 100 people or even a few thousand people. Huh. If you want a great diet and you want a low climate impact diet, there are plenty of places you can go get it. But most of the human beings on this planet can't afford it.
Right. Well, that gets into a whole other territory. We could spend another podcast on in terms of food accessibility. Nigel, because this is what I do most times I talk to you. You, just for a laugh, and also because it's interesting stuff, is so you got your PhD at Oxford, and as I remember, because I wrote it down on a piece of paper and I found the piece of paper, I swear, you did your PhD, as I recall, according to my little scrappy little piece of paper that I got written down that I wrote 5 years ago, in organic biochemistry of it's all scratched out, bionumeralization process. How close?
Mineralization.
See, it's 7 years old, so it's sort of scratched out over there.
Sorry about that.
Yes. Tell us about this, because it always fascinates me when you get out to that level of specificity, or not to be rude, minutia, big stuff to do. What's that all about, and what prompted you to chase that?
It's actually exactly the same thinking that we've been talking about. You couldn't have a better layout than the thinking we've been talking about. So let me first explain very quickly, like the real quick version,
the Clive Circuit version,
what it was about. Okay, so biological systems tend to be very complex. There's lots of molecules in them, and to try and understand them is a difficult task. So what I was looking at was the way in which really simple bacteria deposited crystals inside them. They deposited these crystals in order to be able to float or not float in the sea. And those crystals, the shape of those crystals is not the same as if you grew the same crystals just in a beaker. So from the difference between the way they grow in a beaker and the way they grow in the little microbe, you begin to understand what is impacting and influencing the growth of those crystals. It's a system because there are numerous things impacting it. The concentration of the ions that are going to make up the crystals, the fact that the crystals are first start to grow on the surface of the bacteria, on the membrane surface of the bacteria, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Lots and lots of different factors. But it's a simple enough system that you can start to be able to draw some conclusions from it. Why is that interesting or important? Well, it is really important to be able to control the way crystals grow. And the way I express this is, if you've flown overseas on a Boeing 777-787, you've used some of the thinking that I was developing in my PhD thesis. Because the reason that you can make these huge jet engines now is because you're essentially making the blades of them out of single crystals. That means you can heat them up to intense temperatures and cool them down, and heat them up and cool them down, and they don't fracture and fragment just like a metal would. And so over time, you've got something that is extraordinarily stable. But to do it, you've got to really be able to know how you're going to control the growth of that system, the laying down of that system. And that was the sort of stuff. But for me, it is a perfect example of what we've been talking about. I am, since that time, even before that time, I have been fascinated about the way the world connects together. The connections are what's the fun bit about the world. And that's an example of elements of the world colliding. And that's why it's got this weird title, Inorganic Biochemistry, because everybody thinks that biochemistry is organic, and yet I was doing the inorganic bit. So there you go, Clive.
I meant it to be a layup, not to yank your chain, because every time you tell that story and talk about it, it resonates with me. And there are many lessons, and as I said, we'll come back and talk about. So then what? So how do we talk about innovation against that backdrop? And I think that's really important. And I think you and I have talked. You have like at least six sort of principles that can be applied to innovation. But there's a sort of a philosophical thing that is embedded in everything you said, which is what I've been trying to get at in different ways, which is unless you're willing to look at the whole system, unless you're willing to understand the pieces and how they relate to each other, unless you're willing to look at it from different angles and be willing to relax some of your strongly held views, and unless you're willing to experiment, you're not likely to crack the code in a meaningful way. And it seems to me that humans, and certainly organizations, teach humans to resist that. And therein lies the reason why companies get stuck. And then conversely, when you look at the times and instances where there's been a paradigm breakthrough, and we know those ones, it's because they were able to break that sort of the bounds of that sort of thinking. And if for me, if people walk away from that out of this sort of random bouncing around that we do, which we used to do literally 5 days a week for 3 days, which is why I was such a happy man. I think that that's so crucial and definitely the key to unlocking real value in a commercial construct.
Well, and the only thing I would add, Clive, to that is you can never do all of this yourself. So you got to surround yourself with people like that too.
And different people.
Very different. Very different. Find the most divergent and disagreeable and bring them in. Bring them in.
I had on my very first podcast, the other Nigel, which a good friend, Pete Dalcamaro, had a similar role to yours at Kimberly-Clark, and he had this formula for innovation, which was innovation I equals S to the power of D, which is innovation equals stimulus to the power of diversity, right? And organizations tend to sort of bang these square pegs into round pegs so they can fit them in the holes, and then you wonder why you don't have. But we're going to get into that.
Excellent.
In the next conversation, Dr. Nigel Hughes, my friend, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for taking time. I know you're in the middle of a lot of stuff going on at the shop, so thanks for making time. I appreciate it.
No, thank you, Clive. It's been an absolute pleasure. Take care.
I'll see you in part 2.
This podcast was brought to you by Screen Dragon. We break down barriers, make work flow, and unlock talent. Visit ScreenDragon.com to see our software in action.